Hello and welcome to this week's lecture. This week we're going to talk a little bit about the history of children's literature, a little tiny bit about reading and the importance of reading, and particularly reading for pleasure, and then I want to talk about the book trailer. So the book that's considered the first picture book is the 1657 book by Johann Amos Comenius. It was called Orbis Pictus, The World in Pictures, and it was meant to be used in schools. And you can see here that there's numbers assigned to different parts of this image, and they would have used the numbers and used it as part of a lesson in school, talking about the weather here, I assume. It's also, Orbis Pictus is now the name of an award given by the National Councils for Teacher of Education for outstanding nonfiction. This book, the images would have been done here by some kind of woodcut or some kind of very time-intensive procedure to get images into the book. It wouldn't have been a quick snap picture and put the black and white picture in the book. 1678, Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. If you're a Little Woman fan, the book Little Women by Louisa May Alcott, starring the main character for me was always Josephine March. You'll remember that they read this book and acted out parts of this book throughout the book of Little Women. So it was basically morality, trying to instill a proper way of living into children and young adults. And often early books, and we'll see as we go along, early books were more geared toward teaching morality than reading pleasure, although in Little Women they did get pleasure from this book. Tales of Mother Goose in 1697. This is, of course, a modern version of the tales. The original title was in French. I'm not going to try and pronounce it because my French pronunciation is horrendous. But it was, the translation is Story of Tales from Times Past with Morals. Again, you get the morality part, Tales of Mother Goose. And what they did is they collected oral tales from people, and this was originally meant to be read in the French court. And tales such as Sleeping Beauty, Puss in Boots, Bluebeard, Cinderella were collected for enjoyment in the French court. There was a turning point in children's literature when John Newbery, and you may recognize that name, Newbery, 1713 to 1767, developed a children's publishing house. He was influenced by John Locke's philosophy that children should be taught in a gentler way. And in recognition of his accomplishments within the children's literature field, the Newbery Medal was established in 1922 in the United States. Going back to probably a little more morality type tales, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm in the 1800s collected German versions of oral folk tales, much as Perrault had done earlier, and retold them in their book Household Tales in 1812. They collected and published these folk tales between 1812 and 1822, and also created the first scientific studies of the German language, of mythology and law. They collected over 200 stories from friends and storytellers and old books as a way of holding on to the myths and folklore of the Germanic people. Although the stories generally ended happily, many were filled with violence and trickery which have delighted children but disturbed many moralists and educators up to the present day. Although other books also were quite big on morality, such as Struwwelpeter, again, excuse my atrocious pronunciation, 1845, which showed the gruesome consequences of children when they didn't act properly. And we have all these little poems showing bad consequences. I want to scroll down here to Harriet, the dreadful story of Harriet and the matches. And Harriet would not leave the matches alone. and she catches on fire and burns to ash. So they're quite gruesome tales, but again, trying to make a point of what children should and shouldn't do. This one was Conrad, who mom tells him don't suck your thumb while I'm away, and he does it, and the tailor comes and cuts off both his thumbs. So not happy-go-lucky tales by any means. 1851, you get A Wonder Book for Girls and Boys by Nathaniel Hawthorne, with 60 designs by Walter Crane. 1885, you get a book that's still around, Robert Louis Stevenson, A Child's Garden of Verses. And here you see an early publication. I won't say that's the original publication, but an early version of it. And this you could still get, I don't know what year it is, but it's 80s, 90s version of A Child's Garden of Verses. So sometimes classic literature, as with Grimm's fairy tales and Mother Goose, etc., still classics still survive down till today. The beginning of series books, the Stratemeyer Syndicate in 1899. Actually, Edward Stratemeyer was from Newark. He wrote The Rover Boys beginning in 1899 under the pseudonym Arthur H. Winfield, which is actually a town in New Jersey near Rahway where the books were published. If any of you have been on the Parkway, you might have seen signs for Winfield. Then in 1905, he starts the syndicate to get where he plotted and outlined story ideas and gave them to ghostwriters to complete. And the ghostwriters were paid a flat fee to write these books, which then were published by Stratemeyer. Carolyn Keene was a pseudonym used by more than one writer to write the Nancy Drew stories, and of course Hardy Boys were part of his syndicate also. Mildred Wirt wrote the first 23 Nancy Drew books. She also wrote another series for Stratemeyer. It's interesting, I did some research in the Newark Public Library for my dissertation, and I found a letter from Stratemeyer complaining that his books had been taken out of the library and were no longer carried by the library. At one point, librarians, children's librarians, and this was turned 1905, 1910, something like that, children's series were not considered good literature and not something to be in the library. And this is something to think about when you think about reading and reading for pleasure, that adults like series books. Many adults love a series by a mystery writer, Tom Clancy books, which sometimes have similar plots and concern or about similar things. Probably Elmore Leonard is a better example, but there's all different kinds of series books where we enjoy the characters that show up in those books, and it lowers the cognitive load of having to remember who the characters are. You get to revisit people that you like and people you want to spend time with by reading these series. And so I think series are so important for children, and especially for beginning readers, but we all love series. And at one point, they really were not, Nancy Drew was not really considered proper material for the library. 1902, we have the birth of the modern picture book story, and Beatrix Potter's The Tale of Peter Rabbit is considered the first book to use pictures as well as words to tell the story. If you look at modern picture books, and we'll talk about this when we talk about picture books, the story and the pictures, the best picture books both tell the story. You couldn't have one without the other. There's some great picture books that are wordless, but when you have a book with text, they work together, and what's in the pictures complements what's in the text and vice versa. Other notables from the early 1900s. In 1900, Frank Baum published The Wizard of Oz, the first American classic modern fantasy. Peter Pan was 1904. 1908 was The Wind in the Willow, which is a standard animal tale and was the precursor to many following animal tales. Elephant and Piggy today, if you know that book, kind of comes out of the tradition of animal tales. 1926 was Winnie the Pooh, still popular. 1928, we have Millions of Cats, which was a Newbery Honor book. I wanted to note here the limited use of colors. They often use for color printing. You see you have yellow, white, yellow, red, black, and white. And the limited color palette made it an interesting challenge for early illustrators to use those four colors and make rich and interesting illustrations. So this Millions of Cat, once upon a time there was an old man and an old woman who were very lonely. They decided to get a cat, but when the old man went out searching, he found not one cat, but millions and billions and trillions of cats. Unable to decide which one would be the best pet, he brought them all home. How the old couple came to have just one cat to call their own is a classic tale that's been loved for generations. Story of Ferdinand, again, you see the limited color palette here, white and black and red. This is a children's book that tells the story of a bull who would rather smell flowers than fight in bullfights. He sits in the middle of a bull ring, failing to take heed of any of the provocations of the matador and others to fight. And this interesting 1936, the timing of that is very interesting, a pacifist story right before World War II, as things were boiling over. Very interesting to have such a pacifist story coming out. 1939, you got a classic, Mike Mulligan and His Steam Shovel by Virginia Lee Burton. Mike Mulligan and his steam shovel, Mary Ann, dig the great canals for the big boats to travel through, cut through the large mountains so trains can pass, and hollow out the deep cellars for the great skyscrapers in the city. But with the introduction of gasoline, as opposed to steam, and electric and diesel shovels, it means big trouble for Mike and Mary Ann. Nobody wants an old-fashioned steam shovel like Mary Ann. Mike and Mary Ann find themselves in the little town of Popperville. They make a bid to dig the cellar for the new town hall, promising that if they can't dig the cellar in just one day, they'll accept no payment for the job. The whole town of Popperville turns out to see if Mike and Mary Ann are able to complete the job. Another classic, 1939, we have Madeline. Sometimes you don't realize how long these books have been around, by Ludwig Bemelmans, and this is a classic that many people still love today. 1941, Make Way for Ducklings. This is a Caldecott Medal book, and it's a classic. Mrs. Mallard wants to take her ducklings to Boston Public Gardens. With the help of the Boston police, Mrs. Mallard gets her ducklings safely to the pond. And I was in Boston a few years ago for a conference, and in Boston Commons you can see this sculpture of Mrs. Mallard and her ducklings, and there's even a plaque there. It's been placed there as a tribute to Robert McCloskey, whose story Make Way for Ducklings has made the Boston Public Garden familiar to the children throughout the world. Goodnight Moon is interesting because it's 1947, Margaret Wise Brown. It's a classic, still around, actually often imitated. There's all kinds of Goodnight iPad, Goodnight, all kinds of things. And it tends to evoke a love-hate reaction among people who are in children's literature. I was not in love with this book. Many people think it's just the most amazing book ever. So it seems to be, I don't hate this book, but it was one that I was like, okay, cool, and just didn't trigger my emotions or whatever. But it is been around for a long time, and you can still buy it. The Borrowers, 1953. Here we get into chapter books. We haven't really looked at a whole lot of chapter books, but The Borrowers was an early one. We have the Clock family, Homily Pod and their 14-year-old daughter, Arity, are tiny people who live underneath the kitchen floor of an old English country manor. All their minuscule home furnishings, from postage stamp paintings to champagne cork chairs, are borrowed from the human beings, B-E-A-N-S, who tromp around loudly above them. All is well in their life until Pod is spotted upstairs by a human boy. The Cat in the Hat, 1957. It was an antidote to boring Dick and Jane books drawn from. This was drawn from a vocabulary list for 6 and 7-year-olds with 225 unique words. Bennett Cerf challenged Seuss. After writing this one, he challenged Seuss to write a book with 50 words or less, and thus Green Eggs and Ham was born. So Dr. Seuss was an early proponent, I guess you could say, of mixing entertainment and education, having children really enjoy the books that they're reading. Interestingly enough, Dick and Jane has come back. I can remember See Jane Run, Run Jane Run, from Dick and Jane books, and The Cat in the Hat and Green Eggs and Ham were much more interesting than that. Phantom Tollbooth, 1961 by Norton Juster. This is another classic. For Milo, everything's a bore. When a toll booth mysteriously appears in his room, he drives through only because he's got nothing better to do. But on the other side, things seem different. Milo visits the island of conclusions. You get there by jumping. Learns about time from a ticking watchdog named Tock, and even embarks on a quest to rescue rhyme and reason. In 1962, The Snowy Day came out by Ezra Jack Keats, and this was the Caldecott Award winner. It was interesting because although this was one of the first positive portrayals of an African American child in children's literature, especially one that became this popular, many people think that Keats was indeed an African American himself, but he was not. He just chose this subject matter and developed this book, and it became popular and is still highly popular. And of course, Where the Wild Things Are by Maurice Sendak, 1963. Still, it wasn't that many years ago that they made a movie out of this. I did not want to see that movie, but they did make a movie out of it. So that's just kind of a run through of classics children's books up to the 60s. I just want to mention The Outsiders, 1967. This is considered the first of the true young adult novels and was considered as launching young adult as a category. And now actually there's discussion about young adult taking over. Everybody wants to be in this young adult category, so many novels by women. I was just reading an article the other day. Actually, I skimmed it, so I really can't say too much about it, but they're moving some novels, or they put novels that are more about young adults 18 to 20 whatever in the young adult category, which is really like a teen book. It's kind of a misnomer, but I think was to call them young teen or teen books didn't sound as great as young adult books. I don't know the history of the nomenclature actually, but young adult is considered kind of up to 18, but now the category is being pushed to include older books that adults are reading. And actually some of the best writing is in young adult books, I think. There's some great writing in young adult books. So I'm kind of was bringing you up to the 60s as a historical overview of children's literature up to that point and YA literature up to that point. A lot of the books we're going to talk about from here on out in different genres will be dipping back into maybe as far back as the 50s and 60s for some classics, but we're going to be going forward and looking at the 60s and on up, 70s, 80s, 90s, and looking at genres over that particular time period. So I want to talk a little bit about reading. Since we're talking about literature and selecting literature, I want to connect this back to the new AASL standards. If you've taken foundations or management, you're aware of the new standards. And the new standards are based on, I think, 6 common beliefs, maybe 8. And common belief number 4 has to do with reading. So the standards are for learners. They're basically standards that the American Association of School Librarians came out with, I believe it was last year, that you should be understanding and using in your work with school, with students, and in your school library. You will, if you haven't taken 5130, you will be getting the book in 5130, but I just want to connect it to these standards. There's 2 types of standards we'll be talking about throughout your courses. One is the standards that are used with the learners and in your school library. The other is a set of standards that we as your educators of school librarians need to meet, and you will be working with those standards working with them at the end of your program to connect what you've learned to those standards that are standards for preparation of school librarians. So in this case, this is the standards for learners and for school librarians. And it says that reading is a core of personal and academic competency. In the school library, learners engage with relevant information, resources, and digital learning opportunities in a culture of reading. School librarians initiate and elevate motivational reading initiatives by using story and personal narrative to engage learners. School librarians curate current digital and print materials and technology to provide access to high-quality reading materials that encourage learners, educators, and families to become lifelong learners and readers. So reading, which is the linchpin for every kind of learning that students, every kind of educational learning that students do. You need it for math, you need it for science, you need it for, of course, English, but you need it for all, even PE, you can make an argument you need it there because you need to learn the rules. So reading the rules to a sport, you would need reading. So reading is the linchpin for education, which is why school libraries are so important and why it's important to be a proponent and someone who develops reading, a love of reading and lifelong love of reading in their students. One of the things that's important about reading that I'm going to have you read a little bit about this week and talk in our discussion is reading for pleasure, because I don't believe that you can develop a lifelong love of reading if you don't read for pleasure. And reading for pleasure could mean reading nonfiction, could mean reading series, as I referred to earlier, could mean reading graphic novels, comic books, magazines. I believe in being open to all kinds of reading in order to develop students who will read for pleasure, because that will get them to read more. And the more you read, the more successful you are, and the more you read, the better you read, and the more comprehension you have. It just plays into all kinds of good things. That's my little TED Talk on reading. I just want to mention about Pinterest. Most of you have emailed me your emails, and I've sent out invitations. If I haven't gotten to you yet, if you email me to them, I will be getting to them in the next day or two. I get a lot of emails at the beginning of the semester, and I'm still trying to work through all of them. So what we're going to develop is an overall book list of materials that you will have read throughout the semester, and your other people in the class will have read. So we're going to begin adding to Pinterest as well as your reading log next week with the award winners. I also want to talk about the book trailers that you're going to do. I forget when they're due, but I just want to give you a little bit of information about them. You're going to create a book trailer that's 1 to 2 minutes long. It can be a children's or YA book, fiction or nonfiction. I don't want any adult books. It should be squarely within the YA category if it's an older book. Must have music or voiceover and images. And it cannot be a book that's been already adapted into a movie. Hunger Games, Twilight, Lord of the Rings, etc. Lord of the Rings really wouldn't work anyway, because that is really an adult book. It's often read by YAs, but I would almost consider that an adult book. If you have any questions about whether your book is appropriate or not, you can email me. You can use any technology you want to create this book trailer. Basically, what I want you to do is create a movie trailer for a book. It's going to be the same idea as when you see movie trailers where they tease the movie and they give you enough information that you're interested in going to see the movie. So you need to choose a book and create a script. You don't want to give away endings or twists. You want to tease the reader like movie trailers do. And with your script, you want to decide what text goes with each image. And you can have text that's read, text that goes on your slide. You don't want too much text because you're going to have this as a trailer, and people are not going to, if it's a movie and moving, you're not going to be able to read a lot of the text because it's going from one page to the next. With a voiceover, you can do more. So for images, it should say images and music. I don't know why it says movies. I'm not thinking. You want to make sure that you either give credit. So your ending page should be a list of links for where you've got the images and the music for your book trailer, but they need to be not copyrighted. So you can go into Google and search for images. So what you do is you search for an image. I'm going to use my favorite, dogs. And then you go into more. Well, I'm going to go into images. So we have images, and then go into settings and advanced search. And you want to look for usage rights. So you want to go down here to usage rights and use free to use or share, and do an advanced search. So now these images that come up will be not copyrighted. And let's just pick this one, go in here, and it should be something that, here's the photo details. It says you can consider public domain and has been cleared for release. So you please give the photographer appropriate credit, and you can do that by including a link to this page, or including photo by whatever on your last slide, or your last part of your movie trailer. Morguefile is another source. You can go to free photos. It sounds like a rather dire name. However, it just the morgue was where they kept all the back issues of paper. So you can see here, if we go into free photos and click on this image, it says Morguefile license. You are free to remix, use the work for commercial purpose, and accompany the photos with other content. So you may not claim ownership under it, and you must credit the photographer to use it. So if you use it, so you can do photo by username, or you can link to the photo. Flickr also has some free photos. This photo, if you go down here, you can see it says all rights reserved. That would not be a photo to use. However, if you go here, if it's some rights reserved, click on some rights reserved, it's going to tell you exactly what you can do. You can share it and adapt it, but you need to attribute it, which means you need to indicate the link on the back, and you can do that just by putting a link on your last page. So you can do a basic search in Flickr. Not in Flickr. Let's go to Flickr. And do dogs. And you can then do any license. Click here and use commercial use and modifications, or no known copyright restrictions. And you'll see this picture comes up with public domain. Those are the best ones to use, public domain. I would still indicate the link that you used. Smithsonian also has some great pictures in that are public domain. So for example, this one, go down here, no known copyright restrictions. Smithsonian happens to have their photo stream on Flickr. So it's the same, look for it in the same places. And then sources for music. This page has many different places to go to look for sources for music. If you use something like iMovie, iMovie is going to have, I believe they have sources available within iMovie that are copyright free that you can use. I'm going to put these links under the assignment, so you'll find, or under week 2, either place. I think under the assignment, I'll add at the bottom of the assignment, under the assignment tab, go to book trailers, and I'll add these links. So if you want to use PowerPoint to create your video, you need to add transitions in order to make it play like a movie, and add sound. And when you can review it to play the slideshow, you don't have to save it as a movie, just upload your PowerPoint to Blackboard. You can also use, this is the most basic way to make a book trailer, and one of the reasons I mention it is it's good to know if you are in a school where you might have availability for PowerPoint, but you don't have iPads or other kind of free software, but you do have PowerPoint because you're a Word, a school that uses, most schools have PowerPoint now as part of their software package that are available to students, then it's something that you already have. But please feel free to use any technology that will allow you to have a file that you can upload to Blackboard. Both, I'm going to have you share your book trailers in a discussion board, but also have you upload them to the assignment. So that's to get you started. I don't think it's due for a little while. I don't have it off the top of my head, but that is what you will need to start thinking about for your book trailer. And that is it for this week, and I will see you on the discussion board. Thank you.